There was a lawyer once whose name was Francis Scott Key. Mr. Key penned a song that I'm sure you're aware of. You've seen it, you've heard it. It's in most hymnals in our churches. We call it our national anthem. It is our song as Americans. However, we go to a ball game or we stand in our church services and we sing the words of that song, and they tend to float over our minds and our lips, and we don't even realize what we're singing anymore. Most of us even memorized this as a child, but we never really thought about what it means. Allow me to tell you a story. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer in Baltimore. At this time, the colonies were engaged in vicious conflict with the mother country, Britain. Because of this conflict and the protractedness of it, they had accumulated prisoners on both sides. The American colonies had prisoners, and the British had prisoners. The American government, though, initiated a move. They went to the British and they said, "Let us negotiate for the release of these prisoners." They said, "We'd like to send a man out to discuss this with you." They were holding the American prisoners in boats about 1,000 yards offshore. And they said, "We're going to send a man by the name of Francis Scott Key. He will come out and negotiate to see if we can make a mutual exchange." On the appointed day in a rowboat, he went out to this larger boat and negotiated with the British officials. They reached a conclusion that the men could be exchanged on a 1-for-1 basis. Francis Scott Key, jubilant with the fact that he'd been successful, went down below in one of these boats, and what he had found was a cargo hold full of humanity, of men. And he said, "Men, I've got news for you. Tonight, you are free." He said, "Tonight, I have negotiated successfully your return to the colonies." He said, "You will be taken out of this boat, out of this filth, and out of your chains." As Mr. Key went back up on board to arrange for the passage of the soldiers to the shore, the admiral came and said, "We have a slight problem." He said, "We will still honor our commitment to release these men, but after tonight it will be merely academic." Francis Scott Key, curious, said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, Mr. Key, tonight we have laid an ultimatum upon the colonies. Your people will either capitulate and lay down the colors of that flag that you think so much of, or, do you see that fort right over there, Fort Henry?" He said, "Well, we're going to remove that from the face of the earth." He said, "How are you going to do that?" The admiral said, "If you will, just scan the horizon of the sea." And as he looked, he could see hundreds of little dots, and he said, "That is the entire British war fleet." He said, "All of the gunpowder, all of the armament is being called upon to demolish that fort. It will be here within striking distance in a matter of about 2.5 hours." The general said, "The war is over. These men would be free anyway." He said, "You can't shell that fort. That's a large fort. It's full of women and children." He said, "It's predominantly not even a military fort." The admiral said, "Don't worry about it. We've left them a way out." And he said, "Well, what's that?" And the admiral said, "You see that flag way up there on the rampart? We have told them that if they will just lower that flag, the shelling will stop immediately, and we will know that they've surrendered. And then you'll now be under British rule." Francis Scott Key went down below and told the men what was about to happen. And they asked, "How many ships are there?" And he said, "Hundreds." The ships got closer. Francis Scott Key went back up on top and he said, "Men, I'll shout down to you what's going on as we watch." And as the twilight began to fall, and as the haze hung low over the ocean as it does at sunset, suddenly the British war fleet unleashed. Bam! He said the sound was deafening. There were so many guns that there were no reliefs. He said it was absolutely impossible to talk or hear. He said suddenly the sky, although dark, was suddenly lit. And he said from down below, all he could hear was the men and the prisoners saying, "Tell us where our flag is. What have they done with the flag? Is the flag still flying over the rampart? Tell us, please. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours into the shelling, every time the bomb would explode and it would be close to the flag, they could see the flag in the illuminated red glare of that bomb. And Francis Scott Key would report down to the men below, "It's still up, it's not down." The admiral came. He said, "Your people are insane. What's the matter with them?" He said, "Don't they understand that this is an impossible situation?" Francis Scott Key said he remembered what George Washington had said. He said, "The thing that sets the American Christian apart from all other people in the world is that he will die on his feet before he will live on his knees." The admiral said, "We have now instructed all of the guns to focus on the rampart to take that flag down." He said, "We don't understand something though. Our reconnaissance tells us that that flag has been hit directly again and again and again, and yet it's still flying. We don't understand that." He said, "Now we are about to bring every gun for the next 3 hours to bear on that point." Francis Scott Key said the barrage was unmerciful. All that he could hear was the men down below praying, and their prayer was, "God, keep that flag flying." Sunrise came. He said there was a heavy mist hanging over the land, but the rampart was tall enough. And there stood the flag, completely nondescript and in shreds. The flagpole itself was at a strange angle, but the flag was still at the top. Francis Scott Key went ashore and immediately went into Fort Henry to see what had happened. And what he had found was that the flagpole and that flag had suffered repetitious direct hits. And when it had fallen, men and fathers who knew what it meant for that flag to be on the ground, although knowing that all of the British guns were trained on this point, walked over and held it up humanly until they died. Their bodies were removed and others took their place. Francis Scott Key said what held that flagpole in place at that unusual angle were the bodies of patriots. At this he penned the song, "Oh say, can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?" The debt was demanded. The price, it was paid.